Hi everyone, this is Arpad from the YouTube channel Starpath Academy. I am doing my post-Soviet podcast series where I answer questions posted by my members and viewers who would like to know more about my experiences in the 90s of high inflation post-Soviet Romania. And the question goes: Thank you for talking about how to survive the everyday stuff that we might experience. I hope to hear more regarding the people waking up to high inflation. Were there as many people in denial there as there are here? What took place that made it clear to everyone? You mentioned before that it happened in stages, so I would love to hear more detail. What was the tipping point of all-out panic? Did churches help people? Did many people actually starve? Was there a large homeless population? Another important topic that I would love to know more about were the stages of unemployment as the high inflation took hold. At which intervals did wages go up, and anything you can add about price controls leading to black markets and extreme shortages? Thank you so much. A reply question also asks, this was exactly my question. At what point did people finally figure out that the SHIT had hit the fan and they were in trouble? Because I cannot get family to wake the hell up to what's happening, and more so, what is coming. Right, well, you have to understand that most people didn't wake up only at the time where it was already too late. It's hard to estimate, but my guess is at least 70% to 80% of the people only woke up on the fact that the SHIT hit the fan when it was too late. It's kind of hard to imagine for us, talking about these situations, but I feel that's going to be true in most cases, in most countries. I don't know how or why this works like that. Maybe just cognitive bias or the bias of normalcy, that everything is going to be tomorrow the same as it was yesterday. And I think that's just how it is. Usually 10% of the people kind of lead the charge, and then once the weight has shifted a little bit, more and more people wake up, and then sort of the last 70% will only change once that first 30% has shifted the perception that they are now the majority. And I think that's how things change, not just in behavior, but also in politics and pretty much everything. That's just how things are. So I think you should not be concerned too much on when it will happen. It will happen too late. Just know that it will be too late. And it's especially hard if you have family members in that camp and so on. So I know. But to be honest, my family was also kind of late to the pot and late to the game. But at some point we kind of got angry at the fact that we're late again. And we started making drastic changes in our life, right, when the hyperinflation hit in Romania. So yes, it does happen in stages, right, but it's kind of hard to predict when one stage is over and the next stage has come along. So I don't think that you should count those, but know maybe the very first few stages, which could be the kind of signal that maybe more stages will be coming. So I think that is something that you can take a look at, right? But believe that is pretty much the same whether you are in a depression or a start of a hyperinflation. And that is the residual income, basically the income that people can spend after they have spent on rent, food, energy, and all of the very necessary stuff, that residual income is being shifted consciously or unconsciously. Maybe it's being forced to be shifted into other directions, right? And you can see this happening now with let's just say the income of the companies that produce these types of goods and services. So when this starts falling, it usually indicates that the behavior of the people have shifted, but it's almost like an unconscious behavior. It's just something that is happening, and they don't even know. They just realize, well, okay, we cannot go to, well, they just realize that they cannot go to shopping in some malls or something like that they used to shop, right? Which was sort of maybe high end. Or in modern times, okay, the profit of Netflix is down, right? The profit of some companies are down. People travel less. People do less leisure time activities, and so on and so forth. So the next step would be, of course, the layoffs that happen in this sector, right? And that kind of starts the avalanche, because now the people who are in this sector cannot spend their own money on some other stuff. So it just kind of forms a snowball, and a bigger snowball and bigger snowball, until it becomes an avalanche. One of the hardest hit sectors in Romania was tourism, right? So we had beautiful scenery, we have beautiful scenes, scenery in Romania and some other stuff. And tourism was sort of alive even during communism, whether that was people from outside of the country coming to visit, or whether it was you had, free time in communism that you could spend so many days on taking vacations and so on. However, when the money was being shifted from that sector to other sectors, you could see that something was going on. So, but still, in this case, people are in denial. It's not like this is the waking up stage. This is something that you should take a look at. The easiest thing, if you follow the stock market or you follow earnings reports, then that is something that you need to take a look at, right? If that keeps on for a longer period of time, that usually means that we are entering a recession, right? You don't have to listen too much to the talking heads, but if you can figure out and what the sectors are in the stock market, even if you do have nothing invested in the stock market, or very little like I have, then you can kind of predict of where we are going, right? So that would be the first few things to take a look at. But also restaurants, high-end restaurants moving down. People actually still go out to restaurants, but not as fancy restaurants. So the early stages, actually, you might see a bump in some other restaurant businesses like fast food or something like that, because behavior shifts, but it actually shifts slow. So it shifts downwards a little bit, but doesn't really stop, right? If a family was used to spending time in restaurants, I don't know how many days per week, or whoever goes to restaurants, then you should know that it won't change that much, but the types of restaurants you're going to try out will be shifting downwards, right? So that is something that you need to take a look at, because the profit of those restaurants might go up. If it stays up, then that could mean something. If it eventually drops as well, then we're heading into a deeper recession. Now, I was saying recession, but that's pretty much very similar during high inflationary situations or hyperinflations. It's just counted differently than let's say, not the wages not being there and not the consumers not being there, like in a recession, the consumers being there, however, their salaries buying less and less, right? So it's a bit different, and you might see a bit different behavior shifts, but the end result is very, very similar. Okay, so what took place that made it clear to everyone? So our situation was a bit different, right? So regarding the economy and so forth, it was again different because we went from communism into socialism, and that shift is not what we are experiencing in the in the West. Maybe the exact opposite. I don't know. But we, when we had the revolution of '89, where the dictator was shot and so on and so forth, we had a very clear point that we could point to, that okay, this was the flashpoint, right? Usually that it has to be some kind of flashpoint, but that won't be the exact start, right, of the waking up. I mean, if at that point people still haven't woken up, then they won't be, right? And that was the case in Romania. Actually, there was a huge euphoria that happened for the next couple of months, right? Because, quote unquote, we got rid of communism and so on and so forth. So there was a euphoria. And later on, the economic truth was setting in. So it took at least another half year to almost a year from the flashpoint to people to realize that everything was going down. But the very last point was where their pantries was empty and there was nothing in the store. So that's why I was saying it was too late by miles by the time they woke up. And that was a hard point to achieve in Romania because even during communism we had food shortages and we had it rough, right? And we had energy blackouts and so on. So it was already pretty bad. And people were prepared for things like that, much more than people are prepared now in the West. I would say tenfold, if not 100-fold, we were more prepared because our lifestyle back in communism was that, okay, anytime now the food could run out from the store. We would expect it back in a week, in a month, or something like that. But we would not expect for a full-on regime change and everything being out for longer than that. But we were expecting that, and people also lived sort of in the cycle of the year where they had preserves and they had food stored for next time this year. At least the diligent ones, not necessarily the city dwellers. Of course, it would be much harder for them to do that, but it was kind of understood that you should have at least a couple of weeks worth of food in the pantry, even if you live in the city. That's not the case today. So what would it look like now? It's up for a guess, right? But it's not going to be a pretty one. So you also ask that was there a large homeless population and did many people actually starve? So it was not such a large homeless population because in communism, I mean, we had something like mortgages. It was a bit different, where it was more like the state-run huge factory that you worked your whole life, plus the guarantor of the state, plus you, and plus everything else put together, like the bank, which was really just also another government operation. Only one big government bank that was operating. So it worked like a mortgage, or a very similar one to like a 15-year mortgage, and that would be both the company that, or the mine, or the factory that you would be working for. And it was, of course, there were homeless people. I mean, this is just a promise. It's always just an empty promise that there will be no homeless, and there will be everything solved under these economic solutions that they usually promise, right? However, it was much better in the sense that the home ownership was higher, and even though a lot of people owned a lot of houses, there was also government issued houses if you were high-end bureaucrat somewhere, and there was forced housing, and sometimes they took your land, and they forced you into small apartments. It was kind of a mess, but there was still a homeless population, but I wouldn't say it was that bad as if you go now downtown Los Angeles or downtown San Francisco, right? So we didn't have that. I would say people did starve, yes, and I don't want to talk too much about that, but think about the people who were dependent on government, and I mean, it's hard for me to talk about this, but orphanages, mental institutions, other institutions for the elderly, and all of these systems that were breaking down, right? So when government became bankrupt, almost all of these stopped and to a grinding halt. So it became very, very dire. These situations became very dire. If somebody was dependent on the government and exclusively on the government to feed himself, maybe they had disability or something like that, and they were living far away from neighbors, in the sense, sorry, not neighbors, but family, yeah, then there was a lot of suffering, let's just say that. And yes, people did starve. But also, as you mentioned, and you would have guessed, that churches did help, but it was a hyperinflationary situation. It wasn't like you could go to the church and they had a lot of donations, right? It was basically empty. Maybe you got some 2-week-old bread, and that's it, or something like that, with sugary water or something like that. So it wasn't like you would think now, where you live in Los Angeles and there's a line between the two churches that you cannot, pass. So because the breakdown of the system is wide. It's system wide. It's not like, okay, the homeless population is growing or people are starving, but there's this, I don't know how much percent of the population that is not, right? So everybody was getting reset to the poorest level, right? And those who had no land that they can work on had to immediately find someone to work for on their land, or they would suffer, right? So it was very, very, very important to be able to get out of the cities and work on either your own land, your grandparents' land, or some land, even if it's just 2 acres, 1 acre, and that sort of stuff. You had to do something immediately. So that has happened in Romania. A lot of people moved out from the cities immediately, as did we, right? But remember, that coupled with everyone at least having a couple of weeks worth of food also helped. So we did have that buffer, right? So it wasn't that dire as I would imagine many Western cities would have it now, right? So you kind of have to put it into different context today. Yeah, and about the tipping point and the panic, I mean, it happened, especially again in cities, it happened, but it happened, I would say, already too late. I mean, the writing was pretty much on the wall. If nothing else, not if maybe you couldn't see the fall of communism, right, a year before that, or the system changing, or the monetary system of printing too much money under communism, right? Maybe you were not well versed in economics, but you could see that inflation was getting pretty high even during the reign of Ceausescu, especially at the end of it, right? So not preparing was was foolish, but a lot of people did that, right? They just expected everything to go on forever, which you can see that's also happening here, right? So, the panic was set in where everything was stopped. Basically, the hardware stores and everything was empty. And if it wasn't empty, it was closed. And you couldn't say that it was being emptied. It just stopped existing. Everything just stopped existing for quite some time, right? And then immediately more currency was printed in order to have some functions of government still going at a very basic level of almost like on a machine that, keeps the whole system just alive for people not to have another revolution. Just the water flowing in the system, just some electricity some days, so you could say that, okay, we're trying, or the government is trying their best, right? But the suffering was there, and it was huge, and it was pretty late by the time people realized that it was there. And well, here we have these videos, so hopefully this will help. As for black markets, shortages, and price controls, well, it's actually in the reverse order, right? It first comes with price control, then that will cause shortages, and then the black market will step in order to solve the shortage problem, right? By just simple economic demand and supply. So we had that during communism, not necessarily after communism, right? After communism, or there were some price controls on some items, it was very lenient, and the price control was set only on certain goods that actually the government had complete control over, right? And not necessarily price control, it was more like rationing. I should say it was more rationing afterwards. So price control we had more in communism, and then afterwards we had rationing. Let's say like gasoline and that sort of stuff. And black markets form very fast afterwards, and they are the actual mechanism for finding the price point of goods, right, during these times. We can talk like a full-on episode about black markets, but really it didn't, regarding waking up people, we already had black markets during communism. We had black markets afterwards. It didn't really play that much in hand for how people got to some stuff, right? Some basic produce. And we also had on cooking oil and every basic stuff that you can imagine, right? From lumber, price controls and shortages, to toilet paper. I don't know why we had a huge toilet paper issue in Romania during communism. So, well, okay, I do know why, but it has to also do with price controls and how the economy solves things during a distorted pricing structure, right? It tries to find the most valuable thing that it can produce out of the basic materials, and toilet paper isn't really one of them. Okay, so the other question regarding the wages and how they did increase. So yes, it comes in waves, just like how inflation, it's one of the last waves that happens, especially after food, right? And after the food has increased so much that simply the workers make no wage, living wage, where they cannot even afford food, even with all the subsidies, even with all the price controls, and even with everything that has been implemented by the oligarchs, right? So we had a different structure prior communism, or prior the hyperinflation during communism, where everything was controlled by the state. Of course, even then, the wages always lag. They have to lag, because that is how the communist state kind of forced productivity out of the people who it was ruling over, right? So because the rest that you think about, or what you were taught about communism in your college or whatever, that's theory, right? But then look at communism in China, look at communism in Venezuela and some other states. It follows a very capitalistic model anyway, because it tries to solve market issues, and eventually the ideology fades away. But now you have the sort of a mutant capitalism working within the communist system. So we had a very different system during communism, but afterwards the pricing increases and the wage increases still happened in waves, but more a natural way, where by the way, at every wave peak there's a comeback, right? So there's a peak, there's a fallback, there's another newer, higher peak, there's a fallback. And during every fallback, companies and factories and mines and so on and so forth go out of business. So what happens during these stages is like mini recessions within a larger hyperinflationary loop. And during the mini recessions, a lot of companies go out of business, and usually it goes by sector. And when a sector goes out, it becomes exploitable by foreign interests, and then foreign interests come in. And in our case, it was more Western European countries coming in and picking up where these short recessions killed off the industry, and then they came up, bought up everything in the cheap. So basically, in a future dystopian, let's say unreal scenario, would be is if you are working for a mine and the mine is falling, right, failing because of hyperinflation, and it simply cannot navigate through a high inflationary period, because let's say it's a copper mine, or even you produce copper. Let's just say you're producing copper, and the fuel shortages and the fuel inflation is much higher, where the raw material of copper during a hyperinflationary economic halt, there's no need for copper, and then the copper mine or the factory that produces copper goes out of business, right? And then they let it rot, basically. They let it purposefully, the oligarchs of the country let it completely go to crumble down, basically, right? And then what they do is, let's say another country like China, or someone who is prosperous during the fall of the Western countries, comes in, purchases up the leases, the land leases, the factory, lower than the price of melt value of the machinery that is inside, of course, right? And then they come in and basically save that industry for you. They save that industry for you, and truly they do, right? Because you let it die, right? So it's not like you're blaming them, right? You should blame your own politicians, right? So what would happen in that case? Now the new owners of that sector, right, would come in and see what would be the wage increase that would have to occur for that sector in order for the workers to be able to actually be incentivized to work for it, right? And then there goes your first wave of, well, this would be probably like the third or fourth wave, to be honest, right? Because there are multiple waves, and the first wave would be still locally, the government would be trying to solve some issues, but maybe that the fourth wave would be this, right? And then the wages would increase, right? And you would be the top man in that town because you have the new wages paid in renminbi, right? Of course, maybe not renminbi, but your wages would be set in renminbi, and you would be paid the local currency of your hyperinflated currency, but that would at least still keep up somewhat with the hyperinflation, but not for long, because a new wave of the hyperinflation comes in your own country, right? And then another sector dies off, right? And in the mini recessions of the new wave, some other sector dies off, and so on. Like in our case, the machine building factories, right? And so on and so forth. And eventually everything is taken over, right? Another wave comes, and then eventually hyperinflation dies off, right? A new currency will be printed in the country, and at that point everything was taken over. All right, so I hope this answered some of your questions, and feel free to ask more on buymeacoffee.com or my Patreon.